Hello and welcome to the Platts Oil Markets podcast from S&P Global Commodity Insights, where today we'll be speaking about the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict and the impact that's having on the fuel oil markets. And like any of the markets we're dealing with, it's a significant impact. I'm John Morley, and today I'm going to be joined by three of our editors from the European fuel oil team. We've got Stepan Le Breuck, who covers the high sulfur and low sulfur fuel oil markets. We've got Kelly Norways, who looks at bunkers, and Lawrence Toy, who is looking at the feedstocks and swaps markets. Now, Stepan, if I can start with you. So we'll start on the wholesale fuel oil side. And we've seen that the very low sulfur fuel oil markets, that would be the market that looks at 0.5% marine fuel, that paper market has been very, very backwardated recently, which normally indicates a strong market and higher prices at the prompt than for deferred periods. What is causing this backwardation on the physical side at the moment, Stepan?
Hi, John. Pretty much the main factor that we're seeing right now is just the margins for other refined products and the cracks for things like gasoline and jet. They're so high right now that the incentive is just not really there for European refiners to produce VLSFO from crude. You have all the sweet crude blends going into refineries to produce these refined products that are netting refiners better margins and better profits than something like VLSFO. So you just have less VLSFO in the market as a result, which is something that we were seeing as a kind of structural factor in this market even before the Russia-Ukraine invasion, but is something that's been really kicked into overdrive over the last few months. I mean, if you look at almost any graph for like crack spreads right now, you can see that the road and air fuels are just so much higher than any marine fuels right now. And then on top of that, of course, you still have desulfurization costs that are extremely high due to the extremely high price of LNG, because if you have any sort of desulfurization unit, you need to feed that with hydrogen, and how do you get hydrogen? You need a lot of electricity, and how you get electricity, you need to usually burn LNG. So all of these things kind of come together and make it quite difficult and quite tight on the very low sulfur side of the market.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you can tell there's obviously a lot of reasons why it would be tight in a product like VLSFO at the moment. Is the tightness also related to the availability of VLSFO blend stocks as well?
Yes, yeah, definitely. So there's basically two ways that you can get VLSFO, right? You can either directly crack fuel in a refinery and get refinery grade VLSFO, or you can blend it from a combination of different low sulfur molecules. And we've seen tightness across a number of inputs into the marine fuel pool. So firstly, we've seen very robust feedstocks demand, especially in the US Gulf Coast, where they have quite sophisticated secondary units in their refineries like FCCs or fluid catalytic cracking units that can take low sulfur straight run, especially the kind of 0.2, 0.3% grades that you get out of Skikda and Arzu and some of the other North African streams. That's product that can typically go either into the marine fuel blending pool, or if the margins are really good for refined products, like we were just saying, they can go into those secondary units. So they've been going transatlantic into those secondary units at quite a higher rate right now. So that removes low sulfur molecules from that pool. Then secondly, there's of course the big one, which is gas oil. So 0.1% sulfur gas oil, a very important component of the 0.5% marine fuel blending pool. And that's a market that's been very strongly affected by the Russia-Ukraine situation, given that Russia is such a big and important exporter of middle distillates to Europe. So tightness in that market is very much bleeding over into tightness on the VLSFO side. And then finally, we do see an uptick in 1% fuel oil, or LSFO, amongst utility providers. So given the extremely high cost of LNG, some power generating companies, especially in Eastern or Southern Europe, are increasingly turning to LSFO as an alternative. And that's another important component of the pool that's being removed for VLSFO.
Yes, and of course we are heading into summer now, when it's traditionally the biggest demand season for LSFO, particularly in the Mediterranean from some of those utility companies down there. So it'd be interesting to see how that impacts things going forward and whether some of these markets could get even tighter. Now, that's one source of demand for fuel oil. Traditionally, the biggest source of demand for fuel oil is from the bunkers market. So that would be ships using this type of fuel oil as effectively the petrol for them to run. So let's move to the bunkers market now and Kelly. So Kelly, how's the war in Ukraine impacted different bunker grades in different ways?
Hi, John. It's been a really interesting one in bunker markets. Obviously, all three grades are at all-time highs, and we saw those spike pretty instantly after the invasion of Ukraine. But then, as time's gone on, we've seen the unique pricing dynamics come out across those various fuel grades. On the high sulfur fuel oil side, that's the market that's most directly exposed to Russian supply. Historically, Russian imports have accounted for around well over 80% of supply in Northwest Europe. And next to Iran, there's really no other global net exporter operating anywhere near the scale that Russia is. And to some extent, we're seeing that effect of supply tightness from the lower Russian output due to self-sanctioning, increasing run cuts amongst Russian refineries, and also just the markets looking for alternative sources of supply in order to move against that Russian product. But to some extent, we're yet to see the full effect of a movement away from Russian product. Currently, the EU does have sanctions against Russian oil trade, which came in May 15, but those regulations remain very vague. Currently, those rules state that trade is only permitted with Russian entities where strictly necessary to European energy security. So interpretations of that regulation have been quite varied amongst different suppliers. Even if we're thinking about the understanding of what Russian origin means in the markets, that's varied amongst oil majors and across various suppliers. In recent months, we've seen some oil majors interpret that as meaning as much as 50% of supply could be non-Russian, whereas we've seen an increasing movement now towards saying that non-Russian supply should include no Russian molecules. So we're seeing a tightening there in terms of what people will tolerate in the market. In terms of the effect that we've seen on high sulfur imports after the war, there's really not been too much impact on Northwest Europe so far specifically. We've actually seen imports increase after the invasion. So we've seen higher barrel levels moving into Northwest Europe and specifically the Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp hub. So that leaves people still relatively exposed to potential further sanction moves by the EU or further run cuts by Russian refineries. And you can really see that in the outlook from shipping companies. When we've got bunker prices at such high levels at the moment, you'd expect to see a movement towards the dirtier, cheaper, high sulfur product. And particularly with premiums for the very low sulfur material at such high levels, you'd expect to see a switch towards the 3.5% high sulfur product. But actually, we're increasingly seeing shipping companies considering what availability will look like further out. Looking at quarterly results from shipbuilding companies, for example, we've seen far less investment in fitting ships with scrubbers than we might expect to see purely based on those economics. On the very low sulfur side, there's less direct imports that typically come from Russia, but we are increasingly seeing the impact of market participants or refineries not having the blending components needed to produce that material, much like Stefan was saying earlier. Especially now that we're seeing that lower tolerance for blending with Russian molecules, that's really started to tighten things up in markets. On the very low sulfur side, that's impacted trade flows that we've seen over the last few months, where previously we might have seen the Nordics supplying a lot of the demand in the Mediterranean. Greece and Turkey are now stepping in and supplying a lot of that very low sulfur product. Greece in particular has become a net exporter of very low sulfur for the first time this year, profiting from both imports from Israel, but also significant high sulfur imports continuing from Russia to ports such as Piraeus. Over in Africa, new suppliers that we've seen on the very low sulfur side have included India, which is another buyer that's remained for Russian products. So it's interesting to see how those dynamics have evolved. And then lastly, on the marine gas oil side, again, as Stefan was saying, we are feeling the impact in those markets of the high refined product margins. So essentially, marine gas oil has felt a double impact from the conflict, because not only is the gas oil from Russia now trading at record high levels, but you've also got the impact of refineries essentially deprioritizing production of that product. So not only is diesel taking precedence in terms of what's being produced at the refinery, but also jet fuel becoming more profitable than diesel is then detracting from that pool and dwindling stocks available for that MGO production. And that only stands to increase as we head towards summer driving season and a busier year of air travel. Really a very tight supply outlook across all three grades, but some slightly different dynamics at play there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting, Kelly. And obviously, you spoke about the sanctions that have already come in from May 15, which makes it difficult for EU entities to move certain types of Russian oil outside of the EU. So that's been an interesting dynamic at work. But we do have potentially more sanctions coming in at the end of the year, with potentially an outright ban on any importation of Russian material. Kelly, in the future, do you have any sense of how European oil sanctions on Russia would further disrupt this market?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one, and it will really depend on how efficient those sanctions are. We've heard some sources in the market saying that it's only when you see the markets move that you'll know that those sanctions have had an impact, because, as I mentioned, we've really not seen the effects of measures so far. It is a market that's notorious for workarounds. Previously, when we've had bans on Iranian product, for example, there have been many stories in the market around blending of components that are being sanctioned, or potentially delivery through intermediary countries to fudge the certificate of origin, basically. That's one element that might impact how far the sanctions might affect prices, but also the level of tolerance from EU sanctions that's permitted to continue trade with countries like Hungary or Bulgaria, which we understand will be given some kind of exemption, will also impact how far we see that effect in the market. Interestingly, one of the larger impacts of sanctions might be on the insurance side. We're hearing that bans might also cover insurance companies that are active in Europe. So any entity that has operations in Europe wouldn't be permitted to insure Russian crude that's travelling by sea. And obviously that would include most insurers around the world, so really could have more far-reaching effects. Assuming that sanctions that come in over the next 6 months are effective, the potential impacts we might see are likely to be more on the high sulfur side. Already in countries where we've seen a wholesale movement away from Russian, such as Germany, we've seen extreme tightness in the high sulfur space and a collapse of the high 5 spread. So in Hamburg recently, we've really seen this come into play, hearing around suppliers having to offer very low sulfur product to ship owners that have scrubber fitted vessels, for example. And that's something that's also been flagged in African ports, where high sulfur imports from Europe have fallen off and really tightened supply out there. So that's something that potentially might motivate a further shift away from high sulfur, which we were already beginning to see in the wake of IMO regulations. On a more optimistic side, we are hearing from some shipping companies that potential new supply could come from locations as far away as South America. If that were a possibility to plug the gap in the market, then that would in turn push up shipping demand, as we're seeing these longer trade routes operating in order to supply the market. When we see these prices begin to increase, should sanctions be effective as well, it's possible that there'll be a movement of that demand eastwards to ports like Singapore. And lastly, on a more positive note, the sanctions from Europe, or any impact of sanctions from Europe, might influence more serious considerations of alternative bunker fuels. Already we're hearing people that are promoting these alternative fuels, such as methanol or hydrogen, promoting those materials as more cost-effective solutions while conventional hydrocarbon prices are so elevated. Already this month, we saw the port of Gothenburg in Sweden open for ship-to-ship methanol bunkering, And also several shipping companies are talking about a move to biofuels once they're looking to renew their ships or update their vessels. So it's an interesting one to watch, and it may advance that transition as well.
All right, thanks very much, Kelly. Now, the market all fuel oil markets are impacted by this situation, but potentially the market which could feel most impact is the feedstocks market. So if I can turn to you, Lawrence, traditionally, just how important was Russian material to the feedstocks market in Europe?
Yeah, Russia's been the overwhelming supplier of feedstocks to Europe, comprising around 80 to 90% of the traded volumes, particularly for VGO. What you find is there's actually very few suppliers who export feedstocks. Tends to be the least complex refineries that cannot utilize these extra feedstocks in their secondary processing units, whereas the majority of refineries are actually short of feedstocks and prefer to buy extra feedstocks in their secondary processing units to replace expensive crude oils, which has left the market very, very reliant on Russian exports.
And how's the widespread sanctioning of Russian material that we're seeing? How is that impacting the feedstocks market at the moment?
Well, like many oil products, we've also seen widespread self-sanctioning, which has come since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, February 24th. That's, in effect, left the vast majority of the supply in the market off limits to most buyers. We're hearing only really Greece and Turkey have been taking Russian products, Russian VGO, for instance, of late. That's led to liquidity, in effect, falling off a cliff. One source told me that liquidity has fallen by about fourfold and maybe even fivefold compared to mid-February. That's gone from several trades per day for feedstocks, including cargoes and barges, to maybe only 1 to 2 trades ongoing every week. However, demand remains very strong for feedstocks. This is due to high refined product cracks. So refineries want to maximize the amount of feedstocks they have in order to put those into the secondary units, the hydrocrackers, and produce more economical refined products such as distillates. This obviously has been difficult given the lack of supply and has really led to a bifurcation in the market. So what we're seeing in the minute is very much a two-tier market where non-Russian material, which is very scarce, is trading at a significant premium to the Russian material, which is better supplied. That's softened slightly in recent times just because there's been a bit of a reduction in production of feedstocks from Russia to put a limit on that supply, but it's still quite a hefty premium we're seeing. The main reason for that is just there's not enough non-Russian feedstocks, particularly vacuum gas oil, that can satiate the current demand in the market.
Yeah, and the thing is, when we're looking at the situation at the moment, what's happening in Ukraine, how entrenched everything seems to be, I guess we have to think that the situation for a lot of these companies isn't going to change quickly, and we might not see Russian material quickly reappear in the market. It could be unavailable for quite some time to come. So, Lawrence, how do you think in a market like feedstocks that refineries and buyers can adjust to this new reality of there really being no access to Russian material for most of them?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's hard to see an obvious replacement for the Russian feedstocks. In terms of European refineries, there's very little incentive for the European refiners to sell the feedstocks they produce rather than using them internally. That's because it makes much more sense financially to use those to produce refined products where you can get much better cracks. Often the only cargoes that are offered in Europe from non-Russian sources tend to be from refineries that are undergoing turnarounds or have maintenance, so cannot actually utilize their VGO. There is some talk that if the prices are high enough, there may be some refineries which rely on an external source of hydrogen, and thus expensive natural gas or LNG, at a certain price level may have an incentive to sell VGO rather than produce those refined products. But we haven't seen that materialize in the market yet, and there's been no indication that has come to pass. There's also talk of new flows potentially coming in if prices are high enough from potentially the Middle East, the Jazan refinery in Saudi Arabia, from West Africa or from LATAM. The issue with that is all of those locations have slightly different contents, different sulfur contents to the traditional Russian market, which the European refineries were configured to use. So there would have to be some change in the configurations really to adapt to that. And also many of those sources also will be faced with the competition from the US, which is also looking to acquire extra feedstocks at the same time. So while we've heard that there may have been a few extra cargoes coming in from West Africa, there's been no real significant shift in trade flows at the moment, leaving Europe very short in terms of VGO. What may be the first step for Europe is to focus on running crudes that give better yields of VGO, so being specific on the crudes that the refineries use. That will allow them to maximize the in-house production of vacuum gas oil or high sulfur straight run in order not to be as reliant on the spot market for feedstocks. That's not a perfect solution, but it may be an initial step. However, the overall outlook points to a very tight feedstocks market in Europe for some time to come, which could also trickle down and have ramifications for supply in some refined products too later on.
Thanks very much, Lawrence. Yeah, so I mean, you can see when you listen to everything from feedstocks to fuel oil to bunkers, the impacts on this entire market are really, really big. And it looks like they're here to stay, but that's something we're going to be monitoring very, very closely over the coming months and years potentially. So thanks again to Stepan, to Lawrence and to Kelly for joining me today. Thanks for listening. Stay ahead of the evolution of energy at Platts Live, the new professional platform built extensively for the energy industry. Have your say and join the conversation at plattslive.com.